Welcome to the Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast. I am the host, Gaute Einvoll. One of the fun and inspiring things with working in neuroscience is that the mother of all mysteries is looming in the distant horizon. What is consciousness and how does it arise? Why does it feel like something to be me when I say these sentences? How can atoms constituting my body, mainly carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and some other run-of-the-mill elements, somehow be self-aware and experience things? And does it feel like anything to be a mouse? Philosophers have speculated about this so-called mind-body problem for thousands of years. However, until recently it was almost taboo for respectful scientists to discuss this question. But this has changed in the last decades. And one of the scientists who can take credit for this is today's podcast guest, Christof Koch, a physicist who is also one of the founders of the field of computational neuroscience. Christof was a professor at Caltech in Los Angeles for 25 years, before leaving for Seattle to work at the Allen Brain Institute. Koch was a guest in podcast number 2, where he talked about biophysics of computations, which also happens to be the title of his seminal book from 1999. Here he described in detail the biophysics of information processing in single neurons. In addition to his extensive work on neurophysiology, he has for the last 30 years also worked on addressing the mind-brain problem using a scientific approach. This work was started together with Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of the DNA molecule, with James Watson. On the way, he has written 4 books on the topic. The last one, Then I Am Myself the World, was published this year. These are among my favorite books on the subject. While they are bold and speculative, at times they are written in a very clear way, free from what his collaborator Crick referred to as woolly thinking, that I at least sometimes feel I encounter when I read other books on consciousness. But maybe this reflects that Koch and I share the same scientific background, as we are both trained as physicists. In the podcast, we discuss consciousness from several angles, the phenomenon itself, and the search for neural correlates of consciousness, that is, the minimal nerve cell activity needed, for example, to experience the color red. We also discuss different candidate theories for consciousness, in particular the so-called integrated information theory developed by Giulio Tononi and a collaborator of Christof now working in Wisconsin, USA. This bold theory has exciting implications, namely that mind is everywhere, also in small animals, even plants, and even in a minuscule amount in the thermostat oven. While this is an extraordinary theory with extraordinary claims, I'm personally not put off by that. Whatever the final correct theory for consciousness turns out to be, it will have to be extraordinary. Note that this podcast was recorded in February 2021 as part of my Vett og Vitenskap Popular Science podcast series. I reuse it here as a bonus episode since I believe it can be of interest for many listeners of this Theoretical Neuroscience podcast. This episode was only recorded as audio, so there is no video recording available of the conversation with Christof. Unfortunately, the sound is a bit distorted here and there, but it should be okay. As for all episode information about the episode and relevant links can be found at the webpage theoreticalneuroscience.no. And if you want to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/theoreticalneurosciencepodcast and choose a membership of your liking, for example, at the cost of $1 per month. As a member, you will get access to a video version of the podcast recordings, as well as episode transcripts. And note that there is a 7-day free trial period when you sign up. I also have a YouTube channel called Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast, where you can watch the videos as well. I will be most grateful if you become a Patreon supporter to help me fund the production of the podcast, even if you're not too interested in looking at the videos. But I also appreciate all the other listeners, and I hope that all of you can help spread the word about the podcast to other people in the community on social media or otherwise. Okay, here is Christof. Okay, so welcome to Vett og Vitenskap, Christof Koch.
Thank you much, Gaute, for having me.
Yeah. So, you are something that if you look at your background, you are a physicist turned neurobiologist. And I would say, like, you are one of the founders of computational neuroscience, using sort of methods from physics and maybe computer science to try to figure out how the brain works. And you were like, I think, a professor at Caltech for about 25 years or something. And before you moved on to the Allen Institute in Seattle. So first, maybe you can tell a little bit about the Allen Institute. I think it's one of the coolest institutes in the world, and certainly within brain science.
The Allen Institute for Brain Science, how it was originally named, was started by Paul Allen, the co-founder with Bill Gates of Microsoft, who lived, of course, here in Seattle, and was dedicated to doing a few big projects that couldn't be done within a conventional academic setting. So we did, for example, the first, and it's still one of our most popular products, this atlas of in situ hybridization atlas of all 20,000 genes in the mouse. So you can see in great cellular level detail where exactly specific genes were expressed throughout the entire brain of the mouse. We did this then in the developing mouse, in the non-human primate, and of course also in the human. So we also have a human brain atlas where, again, you can download images, thousands of images from human brains, and see exactly where different genes are expressed throughout the brain. And all of this data is available. You can right now go to our website and you can download brain-map.org, and you can download everything completely free. There's no login required. Everything we do is available.
Yeah, I think it's really fantastic, and I think it's a little bit sort of like almost like paradoxical that the best site for like people like me to get experimental data is actually from a site that was funded by a private person, more or less, right? Paul Allen. While often the public data or the data research funded by the public is often not so easy to get access to. So I think it's really doing a wonderful service to the field.
Yes, that is true. Paul was wealthy enough that he didn't need any fees or user fees, etc. From this basic research. This was really a gift back, and he thought of it as a gift back to humanity. He's done extremely well by Microsoft, so he wanted to give this back. And then he started this in 2003, 2004, and then he became more and more ambitious when he saw this could work very well, and he said, okay, let's do something bigger. So then we expanded the institute to 300 scientists and engineers and staff, and he spent probably close to $1 billion to do this, what we call a 10-year plan. When I came, I drew up this 10-year plan to do a few very large projects that, once again, this is what our motto is: big science, team science, open science. This requires very large number of people from very different disciplines working together in teams that can do things that, again, you can't really do within a university paradigm where you have one grad student and one postdoc and one professor, such as yourself, who have to have a new set of papers. Well, you always have to constantly do something different. So we can do things at scale. So we built these brain observatories where we build this systematic pipeline where we can record from behaving animals, in this case mice, thousands and now tens of thousands of neurons simultaneously while the animal is running, doing some task, having to make a decision. And again, all this data streams off this observatory and is processed and it's made available in the cloud to anybody who wants it, together with metadata like videos of what the animal does, exact location of every neuron we record from anywhere in the brain is put in a high resolution 3-dimensional coordinate systems. And then the other very big project is we're doing this what's called cell census, where we get a complete survey and a complete census of all the different types of neurons in the brain of mice, of monkeys, and of humans using neurosurgical material. Because as we've learned, there isn't just one type of cell or two types of brain cells, but they're probably on the order between 1,000 and 2,000 different types of brain cells.
So, I mean, we have, for people like us, right? I mean, it really has changed the way you can do neuroscience. It's a little bit like you can do theoretical particle physics everywhere in the world because you have places like CERN, right? And now, because of like places like your institute, for example, and also others maybe that try to do the same thing, you can now be everywhere in some sense in the world if you have access to internet and do this and use this data. And of course, we have been collaborating for a couple of years when we work together on some specific aspects of analyzing some of your data. So, I mean, you also, I would say, you're one of the.
And can I just say something?
Absolutely.
Gauti, what we're also doing now is pushing this even further. We're pushing it towards a model that the astronomical community is using. So we have now what's called open scope, where external people such as yourself can apply to run an experiment, a specific experiment, using a specific mice, specific, let's say, visual stimulus. Once it gets past peer review, because each of these proposals gets peer reviewed, we will commit of doing your experiments on our brain observatory. And, we work together with you to optimize the experiment. And we promise we'll give you all the data in a standard format. The only thing you have to do, you then have to do the analysis and the discovery of this data set, and all that will be public. All the data will be made available to everyone 1 year after we took the data.
Oh, it's fantastic. So it's really the new way of doing science. So
I believe so in neuroscience. Yes.
Yeah. If I was extremely rich, I think I would consider funding something similar.
I'm glad to hear so.
Be very rich. I don't really see that happening anytime soon. But because you were like this computational neuroscientist, and you wrote, I will still say that the standard book on how to model single neurons and how single neurons can compute, the biophysics of computation. So I would say you were like, even that, that aspect of your work, established has sort of quite, solid, conventional, even though an exciting new field. But then you also got interested in this other field that has traditionally was a little bit more taboo for a serious scientist like yourself, like the scientific studies of consciousness. How did that happen?
Also, I have a minor in philosophy from the University of Tübingen, and I was always interested how that voice inside our head comes to be. And then I met Francis Crick. So Francis Crick, of course, was the co-discoverer with Jim Watson of DNA and was sort of the singular figure who led molecular biology into its romantic phase, where they discovered, basic biology, the central dogma, etc. But then when he retired, he shifted from molecular biology into neuroscience, and he also asked, why aren't neuroscientists concerned about one of the fundamental mysteries, if not the fundamental mystery? How does life beget consciousness? Because there's nothing in the foundational equation of physics, of general relativity, of quantum mechanics about the fact that these systems can feel, that they can have love and hate and smell and pain and pleasure. Where does that come from? It's not in the chemistry. It's not in the periodic table of elements. It's not in the endless ATGC chat of our genes. Yet here we are. We actually have feelings. How do the feelings come into the world? And science ultimately must address this, one of the central questions that we have as humans. It's really what Aristotle already wrote about 2,400 years ago, the mind-body problem.
I just wonder if, I just thinking about the psychology of Crick when he had like this momentous discovery of the DNA molecule that really just started the whole, explained the origin of life almost, right? So after that, you would like to go on to something even more exciting. Like working on more like menial, normal science problems is maybe a little bit it's not so exciting when you've been through something like that.
Yes, that's a good point. Well, so first of all, of course, he was in molecular biology for 25 years, and he was sort of the main guiding light, and people look towards him to discover, not only the DNA, but then the code, right? The code, it's a triplet code to exactly translate.
Proteins, right?
Yes, the central dogma of molecular biology. There was also him. But then, yes, he became, when it became a very, very large field with 10,000 of people, he returned to one of the questions that he was always interested in from early childhood, which again is sort of the problem of the psyche. This is another term, right? Of the soul, of consciousness. And now he felt he was ready for it, and of course he could do it because he had all this illustrious history behind him, and that really enabled more people to think about this question, because we can point, well, look, Francis Crick is saying this is an interesting science problem.
Yeah.
Because as you point out, conventionally scientists only do this, they're only allowed to do this once they retire. Once you retire, it's okay. Or like Erwin Schrödinger, once you have a Nobel Prize, you can then write about things like consciousness. But before, no, you have to leave that to philosophers.
Yeah.
But that's silly. It's a scientific problem, among others.
Absolutely. And so, you've written 3 books on this subject. You wrote the first one, I guess it was The Quest for Consciousness, 2005. And then you wrote Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist in 2012. And then The Feeling of Life Itself, which came out last year. And I must say, I really like these books, and I just because it's very difficult to be interested in anything about the world without having at least be a little bit curious about consciousness, right? Because it's such the ultimate question. But often it's been difficult to understand these books, because I think it's also both you and Francis Crick referred to. Some of them are quite full with woolly thinking. It's been difficult to understand really what they mean. So I've been frustrated by some books like that, but I think maybe because we have like similar backgrounds in physics, that I sort of understand what you say, and then it's clear when you speculate and what to sort of like base. And so I think for like people with a background in natural science, I think I would really recommend your books as a starting point to get into this question, the science of consciousness. And in one of the books, you called yourself a romantic reductionist. That sounds very nice. But what is a romantic reductionist?
Well, a reductionist is somebody is what you and I do in science, right? Who tries to take a complex phenomena like thermonuclear, how do stars work, and tries to reduce it to its fundamentally components. How does life work? How does seeing work? How does the heart work, right? All these big questions, and then try to take it ultimately to its mechanistic underpinning, right? So you reduce the complexity of the system, but going to the next level or level below, the level, let's see, of molecule, the levels of cells, the level of cellular organelles, of molecules, of atoms, and then you can go further down all the way to strings. So that's what reduction is. You try to account a complex phenomenon in terms of the interactions of simpler constituents that underlie that more complex phenomena. And then romantic in the sense that despite all this, I still have not lost this belief that there seems to be, that we live in a universe that's curiously very conducive to the emergence of complex molecules and ultimately of life. And furthermore, that we live in a universe that's conducive. This life then becomes conscious and ultimately becomes so complex that it becomes conscious of itself. And this fills me with a sense of great deep satisfaction and pleasure. And so that's clearly sort of a much more romantic sentiment. That I can discern the contrails, in the sky. I can, from the contrails left by all of this, I can discern possibly some underlying meaning to this.
Exactly. So despite the fact that you're trying to build an understanding based on the building blocks, smaller and smaller, maybe like building blocks with less and less soul, you still don't lose the big picture that it's what is the
mystery. The mystery that we have this conscious feeling, and it's really a miracle. Why should it be like that, and how come it evolved to be like this?
So I think now when you start, and of course this podcast is going to be about consciousness, and I guess this mind-brain problem that we're talking about goes a long time back. But I guess it's important first to start with that what you really, what you're after. And you're not you're after. Is it correct to say that you're after like the bare bone consciousness, like the basic experience, just the thing that it doesn't even have to have a content, just the thing that that we can experience things. Is that's like the is that the something the molecule of consciousness or the
It feels like something to be alive. And when you're in deep sleep, right, we all slept this night, the last night, and presumably during deep sleep, it feels like nothing. There isn't anyone home. There's no Christof, there's no pain, there's no pleasure, there's no memory, there's simply nothing. Under deep anesthesia, that's the case, and presumably once you die, that's the case. But then there are cases, even when your body's asleep, that you wake up inside your sleeping body and you have experiences, right? Sometimes very strange ones, and we call those dreams. Or right now, I actually have a picture in front of you, in front of me. So I not only respond like a computer would, or like Alexa would, that there is, some auditory signals and you process it and you generate auditory signals, but I actually hear a voice inside my head. I see a movie inside, sort of. I look out at the world and see a movie, and those are ultimately feelings. The feelings of seeing, of hearing, of being me, of having pain. I first really thought about this in context of pain, Gauti. So when you have bad pain, right, and you're trying to distract yourself. So I was on this climbing trip and I had this bad toothache, and you try to distract yourself, and you ask, well, why pain is ultimately painful? Well, so, there's this trigeminous nerve that goes down from your tooth into your spinal cord, into your brain, and then it releases some sodium ions and some potassium ions, right? We know this as neuroscientists, but why should they be bad? Right? Why should the motion of some atoms or some molecules, and people say, well, it has to do with glutamate. Well, okay, fine. So, but why does the release of a molecule of glutamate have to feel like anything? I mean, my liver doesn't feel like anything. My kidney doesn't feel like anything. This cup doesn't feel like anything, but they're all pieces of furniture of the universe. Yet in this brain, it seems to certain types of vibrations, if you want, certain types of neural activity seems to go hand in hand with various conscious sensation. And that is a central mystery. The link between the physics or between certain bodies, brains, and the fact that they have feelings. How do these feelings come about?
And because some people, I think some philosophers maybe have claimed that consciousness is an illusion, which I find that really strange. But what is your comment to that?
Oh, that's complete BS.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe we should step back. So the conventional, what is the conventional explanation? The conventional explanation that we still have in our heads, because it's so obvious, it's very difficult to get rid of, and most people still fervently believe it, is so-called dualism, right? This was really invented by, René Descartes, the father of so much science and also modern philosophy. And he said, well, there are two sorts of stuff, because he wanted to explain this. He was really the one who really put the mind-body problem on the map, because he said, well, there are these two things. There are mental properties and there are physical properties. And it's not clear how the mental properties come about from the physical properties. Right? And then he said, okay, one way to explain it, that there are two fundamentally sorts of stuff, and they're just different. There is res extans, physical stuff that has extension. My cup of coffee, this brain, my body, the brain of dogs and other creatures. That's physical stuff, and there are mechanisms that underlie those. And he speculated about those. Of course, he wrote about optics, and he also did anatomy. Right? He did anatomical dissections. But then he said there's this other stuff, this cognitive stuff that allows us to think, to reason, and to speak, and to have a soul. Of course, he was a devout, this was early 17th century, he was a devout Christian. So he said there was a soul. And he said, okay, so there are these two sorts of stuff. There's my soul, and my soul interacts with my body. And he postulated this particular place in the brain. So it's like a neural correlate of consciousness. He said the place where these two worlds meet is the pineal gland. And today we can say, well, that's ridiculous. But actually, it wasn't quite crazy, because he didn't have access to a microscope. They were already in existence in Holland where he lived, but he didn't have access to one. And if you just look at with the naked eye on the pineal gland, it is a unitary structure. If you've ever seen a brain, it looks like a walnut. It has two halves. There's left hemisphere and there's a right, and everything comes in twos, in pairs. But he said the mind is one. There's only one mind. And then he saw this unitary structure, and he made, just like Crick and Watson, he made this structure-function relationship. Okay, so this turns out to be wrong. But still, we still left with this very powerful model. The soul is sort of the immaterial side of, and that is what consciousness is. And then there is the physical stuff. And this allowed 300 years of physics and neuroscience to develop. Because now you could just worry about the mechanistic stuff, and you could just say, well, consciousness and the soul, that's all in this res cogitans. Now, today we find that very unsatisfactory, because how does this mental stuff interact with the physical stuff, right? If it's really not physical, how can it make me lift my hand, right? Or there. How does it happen? And we have no evidence of this mental world except our own experiences. But the key problem is really the problem of causal interaction. And this was pointed out to him by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia already. She said, well, there's this causal pairing problem. How does the mental cause something physical to happen? And conversely, how does the physical cause something mental to happen? And so then the normal reaction to that is then to say, okay, so clearly dualism is out. It can't be dualism. It has to be monism. And of course, monism just means there's one sort of stuff. And the dominant monism of the 19th and 20th and early 21st century is materialism, or today known as physicalism, right? That everything ultimately is physics. There's nothing but stuff. It might include strings, superstrings, whatever, and causal interaction among stuff, which of course is a very old thought. It's really Democrete, right? Atoms and the void. But then you're faced with this problem. What do you do with conscious experience? And so one reflex is to say, well, it's all an illusion. And the most famous modern and philosophers who says that is Dan Dennett. He says fundamentally we all in the Churchlands, Paul and Pat Churchland also, they say fundamentally we're confused. There really isn't anything like conscious experience. It's all an illusion. And I had this correspondence with Dan Dennett about my pain, where I said, sorry, Dan, this doesn't cut it. You can't tell me when there's this god-awful bad thing pounding away on my molar that, Christof, you're just confused about it. It really doesn't exist. You're not really in pain. That's BS.
Okay.
So they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because the philosophers cannot explain consciousness within a strictly current contemporary physicalist framework. They say, well, therefore it can't exist.
Yeah, no. No, that's a good way. There's the things you don't understand, it doesn't exist. That's
yes.
That's a very practical approach.
Yes.
Must be wrong. Yeah.
Cognitive dissonance. If I don't, I ignore it, it'll go away, and people won't believe it anymore.
So, that's good. So, but anyway, I think one thing when people think about their consciousness is this. Of course, in some sense, or not in the sense you only have access to your own consciousness. I'm direct access, right? I'm sitting in my head and sort of looking out at the world. That's like the first like person experience, and which contrasts this, of course, what I do for my living in science, which is like this third person observation. I'm out looking in at something. But I think one thing is that that it's, even though only I have access to my own conscious experience, there's a lot of experiments you can do nevertheless to test people's consciousness. Like, for example, all this psychophysics thing of like showing people like images for a very short time and ask and check whether. So can you tell a little bit about that? How do they do this?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, one key aspect of mental properties is that they're private. So physical properties, as you said, they have a third person, right? We can all ascertain this coffee cup. how heavy it is, and you and I can do tests on it in a lab to see what is it made out of and what physical property does it have. And same thing with brains, right? Including my own brain or your brain. We can go inside a magnetic scanner and we can test it. We can take a sample from it during surgery, etc., etc. Now, with consciousness, I can't do that. My consciousness is private to me. This is one key aspect of a mental property. Any mental property sort of is associated with a particular experiencer. Now, I infer that other people are conscious. This is an inference. I ultimately, logically can never know this for certain, right? This is an inference. It's an explanation it's the best explanation of all the facts I have. You behave very similar to me, not exactly the same, but very similar to me. If I hit you with a hammer on your toe, you're going to say, ouch, why did this hurts, right? We can look at the mountain scene outside your hut and we can all agree, we can all describe roughly, and we roughly describe the same thing. Or we can do this formally in a lab where I show you certain images, I flash them up briefly on the screen and ask you to tell me, is it a male face or a female face? Or is this face looking to the left or to the right? Or is it, thousands different experiments? And if I do this in many people, I see they all basically respond very similar, except some people, for example, are different. They may be colorblind, or some small subset of people don't recognize faces. They are face blind, right? So there are differences, but very often these differences are very systematic. They are just people who have different types of percepts. But you can study this systematically and lawful. But the challenge is always, it's an inference to the best explanation. I do not fundamentally know. I only have access to my own consciousness. This gets more complicated even when I'm talking about baby, because a baby I can't even speak to anymore. Well, I can speak to, but the baby can't speak back, right? So again, I have to infer that the baby might be conscious by doing certain tests. Same thing with patients that have a stroke or that are seriously injured. How do I know that the patient is still conscious? In each case, you have to infer that. And then it gets more challenging when you're talking about an ape or when you're talking about a dog or cat, right? Many of us have dogs and cats, particularly during the pandemic, and we, of course, convinced that they have feelings. Why? Well, because they are similar to us. They're not the same, but, dog can wag his tail. He can communicate by the bark, by the position of his ears. Is he playful? Is he curious? So again, we always infer. So ultimately, consciousness is in others is always an inference. It's a so-called an abduction.
Because we have two cats, and and it's clear. I mean, obviously so I often feel that how much would I give if I could just be in a cat's mind for like half an hour? How interesting that would be. What it would feel like to be my cat, right? When it looks at me and. It's just, but anyway, I think as a starting point
it's a very good question. Of course, you wouldn't have this. It would not be just like Gaute being in a cat, because then, of course, it's human and a cat. So the question is, the cat, of course, has very different categories. In the way it thinks about. Although we can speak about it later, there might be a possibility to combine a cat brain and your brain. By what I call brain bridging. I think this is in principle at least possible.
But at least if we have as a starting point that at least all healthy adult humans are conscious, I think that's like a reasonable starting point, right? And then we go down.
But you admit, Gaudi, that's an inference, right?
That's true. But I mean, in some sense, that's true. But I'm not too worried about that inference. I mean, and in some sense, when I do physics, right, and I trust that electromagnetism is correct, right? It's also an inference, right? Everything is in some sense an inference if you really try to go down to. I trust the people around me. I don't think everybody's wrong or that there's some kind of. I mean, this. So I think everything. It's not like a new thing that we have to make an inference and move on from there, right?
But for some people, it's challenging from an epistemological point of view, because they don't like sort of that you have to make this inference.
Anyway, but if we start with that, healthy humans healthy adults are conscious. So then And then we go down like to cats and
Wait, what
dogs.
about your daughter? You told me you have a daughter. So
My
she's
daughter,
not. How old
I
is
think
she?
no, she's 22. So
Okay.
yeah, so I
But
consider her conscious.
but before she was an adult, did you also consider her
Yeah,
conscious?
no, that's it. Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, I sometimes wish when I grew up, I don't think I was, well, not certainly not conscious in the way I'm now when I was just a fertilized egg, right? So, but somehow on the way with from like in my when I was before I was born, 9 months, and then as a baby, this consciousness. We've all been through this, right? But we just didn't pay attention. When did I become conscious, right? I mean, it's a sort of a it's like very analogous to the question of what kind of animals have a consciousness, right? I think that like for me, maybe like a cat, the cat consciousness whatever that means is like maybe at the same and must be correspond to some level of development of a baby or a baby or a child, right? You would think. I mean, not the
Well,
same, but
if
complexity, maybe.
ontology reflects phylogeny, which people don't really believe anymore, right? That was sort of a famous saying that development reflects evolution. No, because as a child, the cat probably has some more identity than a small baby. And of course, rapidly after two, any normal child can
Sure.
talk, and a cat can never talk. So
No. No. So, but how far do you? I mean, we're coming back to that, right? That because what we're going to talk about later is this like I think your theory that you emphasize a lot, well, particularly in your last book, but also the previous book, is this integrated information theory, which actually has as a premise or a consequence really is that everything has a little bit of maybe like some kind of proto mind. We're coming back to that, right? But because one thing that is if you sort of look at, I think one argument also is that we are evolutionary connected, right? Meaning that we all, I mean, the first mammal or the mammals started dominating like 65 million years ago or something, and we are all like mice and cats and dogs and monkeys and humans are all just like different steps or like yeah like in a continuum. So it would be strange, wouldn't it, if that like that there's no consciousness until suddenly we are like have this full blown human consciousness, right? That
that's correct. In
yeah
particular, since we think consciousness is associated with the outermost layer of the brain, cortex,
yeah
and particular neocortex, and that's common to all mammals. All mammals have neocortex. And in fact, it's very difficult to distinguish a grain of mouse neocortex from a grain of human
yeah
neocortex. It all looks the same.
yeah. And that's of course one of the reasons that we also it's a favorite animal to just
To
research on
study,
because
correct.
yeah that
Correct.
it's sort of like the same. We're just 1,000 times larger or something. Our brains,
Yes.
right? More
Yes.
or less, right? Yeah. So I mean, one way to approach this problem, which you talked, I think, a lot about, especially in your first book, and it was like this new concept that you and I think you and Francis introduced, or at least popularized, this neural correlates of consciousness. So, what is, or short NCC for short? What is the NCC?
Yeah, it's just the idea that that independent of what philosophy you believe, whether you're dualism or monism or whatever type of monist, there are footprints of consciousness in the brain. In particular, there are sort of minimal mechanisms that are going to be jointly sufficient for any one conscious experience. So I can ask, I see you right now, you, Gaute, on my screen. What are the mechanisms in my brain that give rise to this percept of you? And then if you are replaced by, let's say, my brother, I'm going to talk to my brother in Rome later on. Okay, it's very similar, but it's different. Are there different neurons that are involved, or is it the same neurons? Let's say if it is neurons, is it the same neurons, but they fire slightly different? And then if I hear the voice of, let's say, my wife or the bark of my dog again, are there yet again different neurons? Do they share some commonalities? Is there some set of neurons that are only involved when it's conscious and other neurons that when it's not conscious? Or is it the type of state? like a vibration, like 40 hertz. If the neurons fire in a particular configuration, then I become conscious, and if they don't, then it's all unconscious. Is it a particular type of molecule in a particular type of the brain? In a are there specific genes associated with? So those are all questions you can ask using sort of standard neuroscience. In a magnetic scanner, for instance, I can show you images. Sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't see them, and I can test.
So you just have to trust that I'm answering sort of honestly, and of course this is also something you can test, right? I guess
exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. So I can put in catch trials to make. Are you not cheating, particularly with animals? Because animals, they do whatever they do in their experiments just to get the water reward. So I have to make sure that they aren't cheating by using other tricks. And this is what experimentalists do all their life, right? This is what grad students do. They come up with clever experiments to test this.
The cheating of animals is sort of like almost an argument that they are conscious by itself, right? At least they're very advanced behavior. Of course, everything, yeah.
Well, so this relates to the question of theory of mind. So, knowledge of cheating is different from just cheating, right? If I know that I can trick you by hiding things, right? So this is what primatologists do, right? They try to do this in chimps and in other non-human primates. But that's already a high level of consciousness, right? That's knowing, I know that you know, right? So that's quite sophisticated. Babies don't have that theories of mind, and most animals don't have a theory of mind.
Because children get it at like the age of 3, 4 or something.
Yes,
when they start to grow. Yeah.
Yes, when they start to realize, the children is a little bit like me, and I can hide and I can cheat and I can lie, etc. And
that not everybody has the same information. That is
exactly
like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this is interesting. Yeah. But one example of this. This neurocorrelate of consciousness is this, which you go through in your last book, is this of face recognition. That's sort of like a cool example, isn't it? These face cells in the fusiform gyrus. Can you tell how that was identified as NCCs?
Do you mean the Jennifer Aniston cells?
No, I was thinking about this. I think it was started with the first fMRI and then some electrical stimulation.
Yeah. Okay. So Nancy Canwish at MIT, she was the first really person who sort of recognized this. That if you put people in a scanner, and there are different ways of doing it. In one case, you show them faces versus objects. Spoons and houses versus a bunch of human faces, or cartoon faces, or even sometimes faces of monkeys. There's a part of the brain on both sides, right and left, that becomes active. It's sort of in the back of the brain above the cerebellum. This is called the fusiform face area, FFA, fusiform face area. And you can also take faces and then scramble them, and sort of you have the same low-level part of the image, but in one case they make up a face, and I can see what part of the brain is active. In the other case, it's just all the scrambled stuff. And I can look at it and see what brain is the active, and I can look at the difference. And so this allows me to identify, to correlate conscious face perception with a bunch of active areas in the back of my visual brain. Okay, now cut to neurosurgery. So occasionally in people who have epileptic seizure, the neurosurgeon has to implant electrode to precisely locate the seizure origin so that they can possibly be removed later on, when the seizure can't be controlled by drugs anymore. And so you can come to these same areas, you can identify those areas using these electrodes, but then what you can also do, you can causally perturb the brain. You can now directly electrically excite, by sending small electrical currents, you can excite the part of the brain underneath the electrode. And then you discover, on one side, if you stimulated the left fusiform face area, you don't get much. But if you stimulate the right one, the patient will say, "Oh, sorry, what just happened to your face?" And you do it when he's looking at the doctor while the doctor stimulates. And you get all these weird face distortions. Now, what you don't get, it's not like Matrix. It's not like the Matrix movie. It's not that if you just stimulate let's say the patient's looking at a blank wall, you don't get an image of a face. But if you're looking at a face, if the patient is looking, let's say, at the doctor, stimulating, if you interfere with the underlying neurons by sending an electric current in the brain, you interfere with that conscious perception. So that tells you there's this very close, intimate relationship between electrical activity in this part of the brain and the conscious percept. And so this is an NCC for seeing faces, and it really throws up the fundamental mystery. This is a bunch of physical mechanisms. Yet if you excite them, it's just like taking the brass lamp of Aladdin and you rub it and a genie appears, right? Here you excite it with electric current and then you see. So that's really how does this come about?
I mean, you actually also mentioned this Jennifer Aniston cells. I must say, when I give like popular science talk about the brain science, I always have this Jennifer Aniston cell because it's when people start falling asleep, or I see the glazing of the eyes when I sort of tell about the Jennifer Aniston cells. So that's my safest slide to bring into a popular science talk. But you are actually one of the discoverers of the Jennifer Aniston cells. So maybe you could tell a little bit about that.
So this is in the context of neurosurgery, when the neurosurgeon, in this case Itzhak Fried, an American-Israeli neurosurgeon, puts an electrode into the brain, and then he added these tiny wires, thinner than a hair. They can listen, they can pick up the chat of individual neurons. And then what we did, together with a postdoc in the lab, Rodrigo Quiroga, we showed lots of different images, because this is what patients care about. We showed them loved ones, we showed them, politicians, we showed them famous actresses, etc. And in this one neuron, this neuron fired strongly whenever we showed very different pictures of this actress, this Hollywood actress, Jennifer Aniston, including the text Jennifer Aniston or sort of a cartoon of her. So it was really, these neurons are really quite abstract. They don't respond to a specific, mark on the face or something. They seem to really be active whenever we think of Jennifer Aniston. So that's pretty cool. So you and I have these neurons for people, including, unfortunately, Donald Trump. For anything that we constantly encounter in our environment, our family, our friends, our people on TV, etc. For things like your computer or your cats, you will have specific group of neurons that seem to represent those.
I think when I show this picture, of course, people in our generation, we all know who Jennifer Aniston is, right? There was like Friends and this beautiful actress. But now, well, actually, Friends, this TV show is still quite popular because now when I get to really young people, and I'm worried that they don't really going to recognize her, so maybe you need to redo it with some Rihanna or some new people.
Well, we also have a politician. We have Bill Clinton. One of the first neurons, in fact, was in the PhD thesis of Gabriel Kramer, who's now at Harvard. And that was a Bill Clinton neuron.
So that's good. So, and one study one focus you have had is also trying to isolate what parts of the brain have to be active in order to have conscious experiences, because unfortunately we have experiences with people like being like paraplegic, right, and they are clearly conscious, right? So that means maybe that the spinal cord is not needed, for example, and I guess also there's like this amazing thing that the cerebellum, which is this, right, has we call it little brain in Norway, has like this more, like 4 times or 5 times more neurons than the cortex, but nevertheless, it's not required for consciousness. So what have you found out? What is the latest in terms of what parts of the brain is not involved in consciousness, or maybe the other way? What is like the part of the brain which is most critical for having consciousness?
Well, that's a different question. So there are two different things one has to distinguish. What are the enabling factors for you to be conscious? Okay, what are the background conditions for you to be conscious? For instance, your heart has to beat. If your heart doesn't beat and doesn't supply oxygen, you will faint within 8 to 10 seconds. Right? There are no energy reserves in the brain, and if you cut off the carotids, you will faint. So the heart is a background condition. Likewise, there are a lot of background condition in the brainstem. We know that if you have a lesion in the brainstem, particularly if it's bilateral, even though the lesion might be very small, you will lose consciousness. If it's bilateral, you may lose it permanently. And in fact, you might turn into a so-called patient in a vegetative state, that you will never regain consciousness, although you're still alive. You're clearly alive, but not conscious. So there are these enabling factors, but they themselves don't provide any content. So even if you have an intact brainstem, but your cortex is destroyed, this person will never be conscious. So the actual content provider, the actual physical structure that seems to provide us with consciousness in normal humans is cortex, is that particular neocortex, the outermost layer. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily an animal that doesn't have a cortex isn't conscious, but at least in creatures like us, like mammals, it's neocortex. But it's even more restricted. It's not just all of cortex; it's particular parts of the cortex. Primarily, I believe, based on data from the clinical literature, it's the back part of the brain, the posterior, what we call the posterior hot zone. This part of the cortex that gives rise ultimately to conscious sensation. That's what the clinical evidence.
In the human brain, now what's really at the back is like the primary visual cortex, like where you get signals from the eyes. But that's maybe not required so much.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's not the primary. It's not the primary visual, auditory, somatosensory areas. It's higher up, so it's probably one or two stages beyond primary areas. But it's not the front of the brain either. That's typically associated with high-level intelligence, with moral reasoning, with insights. Those things are all associated with consciousness, but they're different from consciousness. Exactly. There's this fundamental confusion that people confuse intelligence with consciousness. Those are really fundamentally different things. And certainly today, in the age of AI and deep mind, we can imagine highly intelligent machines that aren't conscious at all. Conscious ultimately is about being. It's about sensation. Intelligence is about doing, adjusting to a complex environment and acting in it. Those are two different things. And so the brain structure underlying being conscious, being in pain, being in a state of pleasure are different from the brain states associated with acting intelligently.
Because one area that you mentioned specifically is an area I don't know much about, but it's called claustrum. It's like it's a particular brain, like it's not a very big brain area, is it, or a brain part? But why? What's claustrum is like a candidate for being very important for consciousness, I think, or.
Yeah. So okay. So again, we have So claustrum is this area. It's an elongated structure. It's underneath the cortex. It's above the basal ganglia, but underneath the cortex, and it's fully embedded in white matter tract in axons. So it's between the external and the extreme capsule. It's yay big, so it's like 5 centimeters, very thin. And what's remarkable about it, it has massive two-way connection to and from cortex. So it's a structure that heavily projects onto cortex and receives feedback back. In fact, it's the most connected structure in the human brain of all parts of the brain. And when the last paper that Crick wrote, in fact, he was thinking about it on the day he died, and he wrote on the manuscript 2 days before he died, was what is the because it has such a unique structure, it must have some very unique function. And what in this last paper that Francis Crick and I wrote together, we hypothesized that it may have, it's a guess, it's an educated guess, the role of a conductor of the cortical symphony. What does a conductor do? The conductor looks at all member of the audience, of the orchestra, the winds and the strings and the percussion, etc. And then he helps synchronizing them so that they all come in at the right time, right? The players are out there, he doesn't play, but he helps synchronize them. And so that requires a two-way communication. And this is what the claustrum seems to be doing. It gets input from all the cortical actors and projects back to all the cortical actors. And so this is a hypothesis. People are trying to test it. But again, the question is this a structure that actually mediates consciousness or that enables it or that helps? And so we don't know this at this stage. It's very difficult to reach because it's very thin and elongated. It's not very easy to experimentally manipulate.
But all mammals have it, or
yes, all mammals have it.
yeah. Okay, so now we're sort of coming to the well, really fun stuff. I think the theory. Why we need a theory, and I guess one thing that you mentioned in your book is that it was really. Have you been collaborating a little bit with the quite well-known philosopher David Chalmers, who formulated he formulated like the issues here in terms of the hard problem and the easy problem. So what is the hard problem and the easy problem, the way he talked about it?
Yeah, he popularized this idea, although you can go back all the way to Leibniz. So the easy problem is a problem of function. If consciousness has a function, let's say it's involved in planning or it's involved in in goal-directed behavior. Well, then you can look at various bits and pieces of any mechanisms like the brain. You can see those are involved in planning, and you can do all the stuff that scientists do. You can manipulate it and see how does it affect this function, and you can upregulate it and downregulate it. And you can do everything science does. It may be practically not easy, but conceptually it's it's very straightforward.
Yeah. So because we are already involved in the collaboration on trying to make this model develop further your model for the pyramidal cortex, and that is sort of it's like in some sense the standard science approach. So it's not easy in practice, but we know the program in some sense.
Yes,
we know the program.
And there's no question that if you and I put enough energy and time in this, and if we have enough students and enough computer power, etc., we will find the answer, right? There's no question. This works.
Absolutely.
We know this works. But
just
then
a few months, and then we're done.
Yes, well, 2 years or maybe 10 years, or maybe a century, because people like to fool themselves.
Yeah.
But then he says, well, but that still leaves. Consciousness seems to be above and beyond performing the function. This is again comes back to the central mystery. Even if let's say planning, for sake of argument, is the function of consciousness, right? I need to plan my life, my day, my next 10 minutes. Why does it have to feel like something? This feeling part, right, above and beyond the execution of the function, that seems to be totally gratuitous. And he claims there's no way that science can really can address it. There will always be this explanatory gap between, on the one hand, physical mechanisms like the NCC we talked about. He very much likes the idea of NCC and helped conceptualize it. So you have an NCC for phases in the back of the brain, let's say fusiform phase area, fine. But there's always this gap between activity in this part of the brain giving rise to the conscious perceptual phases and the phenomenology. How do you reach that gap? That is what he calls the hard problem.
So he claimed that like you can never squeeze out this personal feeling out of like the laws of physics, right? Isn't that what he claimed? That it's
he doesn't use that language, yes, but the idea is that how do you turn, so this is another philosopher, Thomas Nagel, the mystery is how does the water of the brain gets turned into the wine of conscious experience. And what somebody else, Giulio Tononi, says, you can take the brain, you can never squeeze sort of the juice of consciousness out of the brain. You can do these correlation studies, and they're very important for clinical reasons. But ultimately, that doesn't explain why any physical mechanism gives rise to consciousness. For that, you need a theory.
Because Roger Penrose, I guess he's now, of course, a very well-known, excellent physicist, but he also had this quite...
Nobel laureate.
What? No,
and a Nobel laureate.
That's true. For the black hole thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but he also wrote these books, which turned out to be like at least bestsellers and quite exciting to read. Where he sort of Emperor's New Brain, I think, was like and he claimed that sort of, or had this idea that consciousness was somehow related to the collapse of the wave function in quantum physics and maybe quantum gravity and so on. So in some sense, this idea that consciousness is hidden in the small gaps of our physics understanding, right? Where like the collapse of the measurements. But here you maybe don't. I don't know what you think about this prospect of finding. I mean, I guess you have another favorite theory which we're coming to. So,
well, first of all, leaving theories aside, so this idea is an old one. John von Neumann was, I think, first in his textbook in 1923 alluded to this. So yes, it may be possible that some macroscopic quantum mechanical effect involving something like entanglement or coherency is responsible for consciousness. So in other words, that maybe we are quantum computers, right? But the evidence for it is right now very thin. The evidence of we by physics standards is 300 degree Kelvin, right? We are a hot system. We are in an aqueous environment, right? This is really very bad for modern quantum computers. They operate at 3 millikelvin. Okay, the ones that Google built and IBM built, they operate at 3 millikelvin above absolute zero. We are a hot object, and we have no evidence that macroscopic quantum mechanical phenomena in the brain itself seem to play any role. I know you had a previous guest, Jojo McFadden, on the who argues otherwise, but I think currently the evidence for macroscopic quantum mechanical effect in the central nervous system is very, very thin.
Yeah. So, but also this, I mean, when I also had another podcast guest, Sean Carroll, who, by the way, has this excellent Mindscape podcast, and talked to him about. He calls himself a poetic naturalist or something. So it's like almost like a romantic reductionist. But he, I think, seemed to believe that maybe that present physics is sufficient to explain consciousness, meaning that it's not because of quantum physics, but because it somehow it's just when the complexity gets high enough, we don't understand how it works, but somehow that is coming to come out of the like the physics we already know. And when I read your first book, The Quest for Consciousness, you seem to be a little bit more open to that idea. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my first book was more like a textbook because there was nothing written really on basic neuroscience and consciousness. And so at the time, and together with Francis Crick, we were sort of more concerned with the problem of consciousness. What do we know about it? And what particularly do we know about its physical correlate and its neuronal correlate? Which structures are important? Which ones are in? Which ones are out? How can we study this? What about sleepwalking? What about drugs, etc., etc.? So it was a broad survey of neuroscience and consciousness. And we didn't really recognize that ultimately you need a theory. Ultimately, you need a theory of consciousness. Then there's chasing down the neuronal footprints into any one structure of the brain. Well, ultimately, that is a program, as we just talked about, Gauti, that will have a successful conclusion. There'll be Nobel Prizes, there'll be textbooks, etc., because that's good old science. But then it still leaves a fundamental mystery. If it's these neurons that give rise to consciousness, why these and not those? If it's complexity, well, is there a magic threshold of 42 that if you are, above 42, you become conscious, and if you're below 42, you're not conscious?
Well, yeah.
How do you explain the structure of consciousness? Yeah. Smell is very different from touch. It's very different from orgasm. It's very different from pain. Right? So you have to have a systematic mapping between your physical system and sort of the phenomenological space. You also want to answer a question that are very difficult to answer with just looking at the neural correlate of consciousness in the human brain. Is a bee conscious? Bee is very different from you and I. You alluded to this before. What about a fetus? When does a fetus first become conscious? Right? You can't ask a fetus. What about is there group consciousness? Right? There are all sorts of people who claim that groups can be conscious. And of course, then the question of the ages. What about computer consciousness? So all those questions cannot be answered by just saying, well, in the adult human brain, it's the posterior hot zone. For that, we need a general theory that tells us which physical system under what condition can give rise to experience.
And I think that's, in your new book, you put a lot of emphasis on this I think your maybe like your best candidate theory at the moment is integrated information theory, which with I mean you and which was first developed by I think now a friend and colleague of yours, Giulio Tononi. So there, because then, as I understand it, there the starting point was not the laws of physics and see how to get sort of experience out of that. It was sort of the opposite way, that it started with what is known about experiences, and sort of like the what are the like the hallmarks of experiences, and then try to find out sort of how matter should be organized to support it, right? And it's is that putting it correctly?
Yeah. And so two things. So first of all, this is a theory that was conceived of by this psychiatrist and neuroscientist, Giulio Tononi, who's Italian but lives since many years in Madison, Wisconsin, here in the Midwest. And it's really his ideas that have led the development of integrated information theory, or IIT. It's now known as IIT. And yes, I've interacted with him over the years. We're very good friends, and I've interacted with him, published many papers, but it's really his idea. And yes, because the idea is you cannot take the brain and squeeze consciousness out of it. So you can't say, well, it's 40 hertz gamma oscillation, or it's a posterior hot zone, or it's a collapse of the wave function. Because those are all physical things, and how do they relate to consciousness? So you have to start the other way. You have to start with consciousness. You have to start with what is the only thing. This goes back to René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, je pense donc je suis. The only thing I know is that I have conscious experiences, right? They exist. They exist for me. They're intrinsic to me. They don't need anyone else. They don't need God or my family or you or anyone else. They're intrinsic to me. They're structured in a particular way. There's, if I look at space, there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's inclusion, there's dots, there's distances. Okay, they're very specific. They are specific, so they are the way they are. If they would be different, it would be a different conscious experience. There's only one experience at this one time. There's one experience, and it's definite. There's certain things that are in, and there's certain things that are out. Right now, I don't have an experience of pain. Right. So right now there is no pain. Pain is out, but lots of other things are in. So these are sort of it's an axiomatic formulation. You start out, what are the properties of any conscious experience that are that you cannot doubt. So in that sense, it's a very fundamental. So you start with those five, then you think about mechanism. What is it in a physical world that has mechanisms in a state and that have causal power? What is it that could give rise to these five properties?
So in some sense, it's quite analogous to how we formulate physics theories. We sort of say, what is really the key features of the phenomenon we want to explain, which is sort of like sometimes the axioms, and then you try to make a theory accommodating that afterwards.
That's correct. That's correct.
So it's not a theory for intelligence or cognition or thinking. It's really a theory for experience.
Correct.
And it's not dualism in this Descartes sense. It's because it's not that, because you have mind and matter, but the mind really relies on matter. You cannot have a mind without matter, right? Or you cannot have experiences without matter. Isn't that correct? I think you
ultimately
you wrote about you had a meeting with Dalai Lama. That was very cool. Maybe you can tell about this.
Well, yeah. So I met him twice, and we had long discussions about consciousness, and we talked at some point also about the reincarnation, and I said that doesn't work, because I made this koan up. It came to me on the spot. I said 4 words: no brain, never mind. No brain, never mind. Without a mechanism, you need some mechanism. Without a mechanism, there cannot be mind. You need some mechanism. It could be something esoteric, like gravitational waves or whatever, but there has to be a mechanism. Otherwise, you don't get consciousness. So in that sense, it's bound to some mechanism. Look, IIT says ultimately the only thing there is
IIT is just short for integrated information theory.
Yeah, integrated information theory. There's a mechanism, and then there's causes. That's all there is. The rest is void. And there's external causal power and intrinsic causal power. It's a key distinction in the theory. Extrinsic causal power is causal power any one mechanism has upon another one. So gravity.
So I think causal power is maybe not for all listeners, but it's really that if you have one thing that can affect another, right? Maybe like one particle pushing on another particle, or one neuron sending a signal to another neuron, right? That's correct. Then they have causal power. That's what you mean, right?
Causal power is that makes something do, right? Right. You need to. How do I know anything exists ultimately? Well, I know it exists because I can causally interact with it. I can push it. I can probe it. It can push back. I can measure it. Like the moon, I know the moon exists because I can look at the rise of the tides. Right. I can infer the tides. Even I don't even have to see it. I can just look at the rise and fall of the water. So how do we know things exist? Because the causal effects. It's a key principle in physics. Why do we not believe in ether anymore? Because it doesn't seem to have any causal power. So we get rid of it. So ultimately, there's causal power. There's causal power of one thing upon something else. That's external causal power. And then there's intrinsic causal power. So this is the ability of a system, given its current state, to influence which states it will evolve to in the next instant.
So it's like, say, like two neurons sending signals to each other and then affecting each other, right? That's like one. Or two. They have like intrinsic.
Yeah. Yes. Or transistors that have charges on them, and the charge flows along the wires and does something. Yes, that's intrinsic power, intrinsic causal power, and fundamentally the theory says, and it sounds profoundly weird and counterintuitive and meaningless, that ultimately consciousness is just causal power.
But that is sort of That is sort of the assumption, right? Just like the starting point that
correct.
So the idea is that he looked at these five points that you mentioned, that the characteristics of experience,
the five axiomatic properties of consciousness,
made this theory which sort of had these postulates built in, and then they said that this causal power idea is somehow compatible with this idea, or how does that work?
No, so there are these five fundamental sort of axioms of existence of consciousness. Consciousness exists. It's particular, it's specific, it's one, and it's definite. It's only one. And then you say, well, what exists ultimately is things that have causal power upon themselves. This goes back to Plato.
Okay.
And then he defines this. So he takes very simple systems, like very simple neural nets that can be either on or off, and you can actually compute this causal power.
Oh, okay. So the key starting point is really, well, if it exists, then you have to be able to interact with it somehow, or it must have this causal power. If not, it doesn't
upon
exist.
Itself or upon itself. Yes. If it has no causal power upon itself or upon anything else, it may as well not exist, because it makes no difference to the universe.
And then the idea is that somehow there's the level of this intrinsic causal power, how complicated it is, or how intricately they are connected somehow, gives a measure of how conscious this system is. Is that correct?
Correct. So phi is Greek letter phi that can be 0 or positive. It's a pure number. It's not measured in bits, most importantly. That tells you how much the system is irreducible. It's really, technically speaking, a measure of the irreducibility of the system. If the phi of a system is 0, it strictly speaking doesn't exist for itself. It's like
Can you explain irreducible? That's a little bit complicated.
Well, if I take two systems, let's say two brains, your brain and my brain. Do they exist as a whole? Do they have some existence as a whole, or should they be better treated as individual systems that have a weak interaction?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Or I can take my brain, my normal brain that has two halves, the left brain and the half brain, that are interconnected by 200 million fibers called the corpus callosum. And sometimes during neurosurgery, it becomes necessary to prevent the spreading of seizures from one brain to the other brain to cut those fibers. It's called a split brain. procedure, and now I have a brain that's sort of, it's just like a walnut that I cut in the middle. Now I have two separate brains, and they only interact very weakly. So now they don't exist as a system anymore. So irreducibility really tells you how much is a system irreducible to its individual components. If a system is irreducible, that means if you cut it, you will lose some aspect of it, and you can, compute it using entropy and things like that. And so phi tells you to what extent a system is irreducible, and it's a measure of the quantity, not the quality, but the quantity of consciousness. The idea is you can, in principle, measure phi. It depends on the density of interactions, of the causal interaction of any one system. And the bigger the phi, the more irreducible is the system, the more it's conscious.
Yeah. So in principle, I mean, we'll look at my brain, for example, then you could sort of compute this phi following this recipe in principle then, and see that you get a smaller value when I'm asleep maybe, and even small, particularly when I have a deep sleep, and maybe like intermediate when I'm dreaming, and then the highest. So in principle, it gives a recipe for this level of consciousness.
That's entirely correct, and you can measure it across your lifetime as a baby, as a teenager, as an old man. You can do it in patients. You can do it in animals. That's correct.
And then it sort of is exactly. So then it's and then it's not really it's not only living systems that has this, where you have this phi. Everything, even a proton that consists of three quarks that are interacting have according to this theory, a little bit of phi.
Yes and no. So in principle, it is true that something that's irreducible, like a proton that consists out of three quarks, if it's irreducible, it will have a phi, maybe 0.00000, whatever, 10 to the minus 27. But yes, it may have an itsy bitsy of phi. What does it mean? That means just like temperature, look, there's a temperature in outer space. It's 2.7 degrees Kelvin, right? Although it's unimaginable cold in outer space, there is still this afterglow, the microwave background radiation. And so this also says, yes, it may be that even very simple systems feel like something. And if they dissolve into individual components, then they wouldn't have this itsy bitsy feeling anymore. However, not everything has it. So for instance, because the theory, because of this postulate of definiteness, it looks for a maximum. It looks at a system like the brain or like a computer or like the sun or whatever, and it computes over all possible scales in space, in time, in granularity. What is the maximum of this phi? And a system only exists at the maximum level of irreducibility. That is when the system exists for itself, and only that system is conscious. Consciousness is ultimately maximum irreducibility, maximum intrinsic causal power. So if I look at, let's say, you and I, we interact, right? So yes, so there's some measure of phi. We have there's a peak of phi in my brain. There's a peak of phi in your brain. And then because we interact by language, I ask you something, you reply, etc., there might be a modicum of interaction between us. However, the combined system, Gaute and I, its phi is vastly less than the phi of just me or the phi of just you. Therefore, there is no conscious system that is simultaneously you and I. There's only you and there's me. So you and I are not conscious. You are conscious, I'm conscious. Same logic applies to individual neurons, because I can ask, are neurons conscious? In my brain, again, I look at all possible scales. I look at my entire brain. I look at just my cortex. I look at just the posterior hot zone. I look at just 10 neurons. And I look at all these different combinations. And I say that consciousness only exists at that scale, spatial, temporal, granularity scale, which is maximum. So there is one particular set of things that will be a maximum, and only that exists for itself, only that is conscious.
But that would also mean that there's always been some mind in the universe, right? I mean, because there was always something that was maximum. So, I mean, if you go back to Big Bang, was there always like a phi? Was it a little bit of mind?
It is possible, yes, it is quite likely that there was always that is really that it's part and parcel of the structure of the universe, that if there are systems that are irreducible, they are tiny bit end-minded.
So exactly.
And this, of course, brings forth a very ancient belief that many philosophers had in the West and in the East. Plato famously, Leibniz, of course, Schopenhauer, and although Russell, Sir Bertrand Russell, the physicist, called panpsychism, right? Pan meaning everything, and psyche meaning soul. That possible everything is in soul. So IIT shares certain intuition and sentiments with this panpsychism. Not everything is, but many more systems have some aspects of interiority. That's really what we're talking about. It's like there's some systems have no interiority. They're just external. They just are external power. But certain systems like your brain and my brain also have this inner aspect. It feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be you.
So are there any? I was just thinking that when I was undergoing surgery for I had to remove my appendix in Japan actually, and then I got this propofol, and then I was really gone for 5 hours in a way that is much more than just sleeping for 5 hours, because then you have feeling that time has passed. But if you had calculated my phi during this surgery, it wouldn't have been 0, right? It was. So it's maybe some kind of parameter, some threshold in order to feel something. It has to be larger than 42, or
no? It's a parameter-free theory. No, what happens to neurosurgery?
So why didn't I feel anything?
Well, now I have to look at exactly what is the mechanism of propofol, and we know something about it, right? Yeah. Partly what happens, the brain becomes synchronized in these, they go to these very slow on and off state, these very slow oscillations. And now the you that's right now, the conscious Gauto, exists at a very different spatial temporal scale. So this brain under anesthesia had some phi different from 0, I grant you that. But its spatial temporal granularity organization is very different. And I'm not saying that this brain had 0 phi during consciousness, but the phi might have been so unconceivable small that it just doesn't feel like much anything compared to your waking consciousness. Plus, it's not you. The Gaute was in a very different form because of your entire spatial temporal organization of your brain under anesthesia is radically different.
So I was also thinking this if you look at these 5 postulates and then you want to construct a theory from it, how unique is IIT? Could it be other theories that also encapsulate these five postulates?
Yeah, it is. So mathematicians are working on that. So because the theory is rather elegant, there are lots of mathematicians and also philosophers working on it. And so one question is exactly, given the postulates, is it mathematically unique? And what is it up to some null space? And what is that null space? So I don't know the answer. It may well be that there are other instances that also satisfy the same postulates, but that have different mathematics. That's quite likely. But, then we get back to the situation in physics, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Sure. Yeah.
What about, quantum mechanics seems to be the best description we have, but why quantum mechanics?
I agree.
All these
But I think, we would say that that's true. But we have reason to say that quantum mechanics is more, covers more than classical physics, right? But then
you have the problem of naturalness, right? You have all these constants, and
they're not. I'm more thinking that if you want to, if you have this theory for consciousness, right? You could imagine getting more and more experience and more experiments, or more features of experiences which are mapped out that can distinguish between two theories which are both compatible with these postulates, say.
Correct. But I think we're still quite a bit away from that.
Yeah. No,
so the theory feels counterintuitive, but it's very precise. It makes very precise statements that can be tested and verified and falsified. And of course, we know this from physics, right? If a theory makes very counterintuitive predictions that turn out to be true, that's very strong. So for instance, it makes a falling prediction. I always love talking about this. the inverse of the split brain experiment. So as I mentioned before, we know this, and Roger Sperry got a Nobel Prize for it. If we take a normal brain like you and I, and we cut it along the middle, along the midline, we prevent epileptic seizures, and we create two conscious beings, as far as we can tell. There are two of you now, they're inside your skull, and your left hemisphere controls your right side of the body, and the right controls the left side of the body. And there are all sorts of things happening early on in the patient that are weird, where they act independently. Of course, you only speak with the left hemisphere, right? And very quickly, behaviorally, the body established dominance, but there are really two conscious entities inside this one skull. Now let's take the opposite. Let's take your brain and my brain, and let's use this new technology yet to be invented called brain bridging that directly connects some of my neurons with some of your neurons. Okay, so let's think about this. Early on, I connect my visual cortex with your visual cortex. I'm still Christof, you're still Gaute, but now I can begin to see through your eyes because I directly see your visual cortex. And let's add more and more connection. The theory says, IT says, every time to compute what is consciousness, I need to compute what's the maximum of phi. Well, as long as I have my massive brain and there are only a few wires between my brain and your brain, the maximum will always be my brain and locally in your brain. So there'll always be two conscious entities. But at some point, there might come a point when I add a single additional wire, it's like a phase transition, when suddenly the maximum isn't here and here anymore, suddenly the maximum goes across both. What does that mean? At that point, you and I will disappear instantaneous. There will be no more Gaute, then there will be no more Christof, but there will be this new thing, this amalgamation of Christof and Gaute. Right? It's like, I'm a big fan of Wagner. Tristan and Isolde.
Yeah, well, I know I know a little bit about the story, right? They really got integrated.
Well, no, that's a tragedy of lovers. Even though when your bodies interpenetrate, you are still you and she is still her, right? And you never know, you can feel her, but you cannot directly feel her. You're right. You don't have directly access to her conscious state and vice versa. But in this brain bridging, at least in principle, once I brain bridge, there will be I will lose my individuality, you will lose your individuality, and we are one. We are now, by definition, by the theory, one conscious mind. And then if you cut the connection again, we fall back into our individual brains. Again, this could be tested in animals. This could be tested in mice and ultimately in people.
And also, I don't know, like Siamese twins, right? If they are, some of these, if they have ever had so interconnected brains that they really have one consciousness?
Well, there's some evidence. There's one pair of twins, the Tatiana twins, north of here in Canada, and they have a so-called thalamic bridge. So due to developmental defect, their brains were interconnected at birth. And it's really strange to look at them. There's a video, the New York Times did an article upon it, and you can see these little girls running around, but they're always connected. They're always, and this gives rise to all sorts of interesting questions. Sometimes they're clearly different. If you talk to the mom, she says, oh yeah, one girl likes ice cream and the other one likes that sort of taste. So they have different tastes, etc. But they always go to bed together. They always fall asleep together. So there may be states when they are one conscious, and there might be states when they're two different consciousness. It's an extremely interesting phenomenon. The parents don't want their daughters to be studied, of course. So we don't know much about it. But it's a very real possibility.
Now I'm going to ask the question that you wrote in your book that you often get. Like a common objection. So I thought you should be given the opportunity, a common objection to IIT. And then that is so I should give you the opportunity to just answer that objection. I'm quite sure some of the listeners have this question maybe. So why should it feel like something to have a maximum value of integrated information? Why should it feel like something to have a large phi max?
So there are two ways to approach this. One is because you start out with that. You start out with phenomenology. You don't start out with physics. You don't say, well, it's this or that physical mechanism, and therefore I postulate it's conscious. The theories start out, these are the properties of any one conscious experience. It is.
So this is like Newton starting out with the laws of gravity, saying, well, the force, we assume that the force is an attractive force that behaves like this, right? So it's the same
Yes.
kind of.
It's built into the assumption, and ultimately, why does the universe? I don't know whether this will ever have an answer. All I can say, the theory has consequences, makes lots of precise prediction, and you can test these predictions. And to the extent that these predictions will turn out to be true, this will be a better and better description of what actually exists in our universe.
So another theory that's been sort of, at least like an outsider in this field, I've heard about the IIT, and I also heard about the global workspace theory. So what is the global workspace theory, and how does it relate to IIT? Or what's the connection?
Okay. Yeah. So the two dominant theories, sort of scientific theories, as IIT and then global neuronal workspace theory. The current version is really known as global neuronal workspace. It traces its way back to computer architecture, the blackboard architecture of the 50s and 60s by Bernie Banks, and then was really popularized by two French scientists, Jean-Pierre Changeux and Stan Dehaene. And ultimately, it says it's a very different animal from IIT. It says consciousness ultimately happens, so it looks at the architecture of the brain. So this is now specific to the brain, and says, well, there is this, and this is very true, unconscious activity usually is local to a particular circuit. So my brain, turns out, can do all sorts of things. My eyes can move, my hands can move, all of this without me consciously knowing about it. Yet whenever information is conscious, it's globally available. When I am, and in fact, they elevate this to the definition. The definition of consciousness is information is broadcast, it comes into this global workspace. That means it's broadcast to many parts of the brain, to the speech part, to the memory part, to the planning part, to the sensory stages. And in that act of broadcasting through a particular set of neurons in the front of the brain that project throughout the brain, particularly that project back into the posterior part, in this act of broadcasting, that is what consciousness is.
So then implicitly, instead of saying that what feels like something is phi max in some sense, or what tells you about whether you have a conscious feeling or not, they say instead when you have this like global connections like oscillations going back and forth between like maybe across the brain, that is what feels like something. So it's like so is it a theory on the same footing, even though the details are different?
No, because it ultimately, it doesn't address the feeling part. It's much more in the behaviorist tradition. Ultimately, it says there isn't anything above and beyond the physics. There isn't anything beyond the info. There's this relay of information from the front of the brain to the back. In the forms of action potentials, etc.
So it's a theory for the neural correlates of consciousness more.
G&W says that's all there is.
Okay.
The feeling really isn't scientific. Whether or not that is a real thing, they don't talk about. It's sort of in that sense, it's more. So
it's not really a theory for the same. It's not trying to explain the same thing in some sense.
Well, yes and no. It tries to explain the same behavior. In fact, I'll come to this adversarial collaboration, right? So it does try to address certain things that people do when they're conscious, or in the act of becoming conscious, they push certain buttons, certain parts of the brain are active. And so in that sense, both theories overlap. But fundamentally, finally, the theories have a very different attitude to the interiority, to conscious feelings. For IIT, it's central. That's ultimately what there is. And GNW either doesn't comment, either says some version it doesn't exist, or there isn't anything scientifically one can say meaningful about it. So how do you test this? So there's now, you may have heard this adversarial collaboration.
Well, I can guess what it is, but that's it's
Okay, so almost 3 years ago, we started, we had a meeting here at my institute, Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, where we funded by promoted by the Templeton Foundation, particularly by one individual, David Podgieter. We assembled a small meeting of 20 people in Seattle between IIT and GNW. And we said we want to do something similar to what Eddington did in 1917, 1918, 1919, when he organized the expedition to South America and to West Africa to observe the solar eclipse to test general relativity. Because, there were three clear predictions. There was classical Newton and then modified Newton and general relativity about what the deflection of the starlight by the sun. So we wanted to do something similar. Can we agree on a set of experiments that we can carry out where if they go one way, they support IIT, and we'll say so ahead of time. And if the outcome is a different way, they will support GNW. And we agree on this experiment ahead of time. We put it out on our open science, and then we test it and to see which theory is actually true.
Okay.
This is called an adversarial collaboration. It's tricky because people are, of course, they want to game the system. They want to be, because if you push people, you have to make a prediction here. You can't have a waffle factor. You have to tell me. Do you?
I think it sounds like good. There's not this. This shouldn't be adversarial. Like this, everybody should. This should be. If we were just like
but no one does.
No,
of course.
No, but
of course.
No, that's right.
But no one does.
No.
Typically what you do, this is how science works in the biomedical sciences. You have a favorite theory, you do an experiment. Of course, you publish a paper only if it supports your theory, right? And then in the very end, in the discussion, you said, well, clearly this theory shows that the opposite theory of Professor Y is wrong. That's it, right?
Not very impressive, but that's maybe how we are.
Yeah, but this is how it is. Rather than saying from the get-go, if there are two theories, let's try to directly pit them head to head and come up with an experiment that was distinguished between one theory and the other. And so that's what we're trying to do right now. There's an ongoing experiment involving 10 labs and 500 subjects using fMRI and EEG and MEG and ECOG to directly test IIT, some of the predictions between IIT and GNW, because in some sense, they differ a lot in their fundamental assumption about what exists, but they have practical consequences in the brain about where is the neural correlate of consciousness located? Is it in the back or in the front? And what is the timing of the neural correlate of consciousness? And that can be tested experimentally.
So, you mentioned this podcast I had on quantum biology with John Joe McFadden. And he had this idea, he actually sent me a preprint, that the space between neurons, this extracellular space, it's called, and both of you and I have worked on this, trying to understand like how to interpret signals recorded there, and so on. So he sort of had this idea that the extracellular space could be very important for consciousness. I don't know, because it acts like it's like another path between neurons, right? A more direct path, even though it's less specific. So, off the top of your head, what do you think of that idea? Could the extracellular space be important to increase this phi?
I don't know. I mean, the question, lots of things are important in the brain. There are 30 different neurotransmitter systems. They're important. There are, gazillion of neuronal structures. They're important. Yes. Look, we know extracellular space shrinks and waxes and wanes during sleep. We know during sleep, it has to be cleared. We know, it shrinks when in the aging brain. It changes during Alzheimer's. So yes, it's one important component of the brain, one of many.
So, now I think that the IIT theory sort of makes the link for sort of like between matter and mind, saying that, well, if this is the way things are hooked up, you get this amount of phi, and it feels like something, and this determines like the level of consciousness or what you feel. But what about the other way? How does the mental affect the physical matter? How? What do you?
Well, they are the same. They are the maximum. So, you're talking about free will now, right? The problem of causation.
Yeah, exactly. We have this feeling that we have a free will now. I'm conscious. I want to move this cup, so I control my muscles, right?
Yeah. Every time I want to raise my hand, there she goes.
Yeah, exactly.
I have free will. There's no question. I have free will.
Yeah, but how did you? How does that work? I don't see how that works. How it's the consciousness. So you do, yeah.
All right. So let me.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's leave aside the question: is it free or not? That's because what do we mean by free and all of that? Yeah. But the theory says that the feeling of wanting is a conscious experience that can be manipulated like any other conscious experience. In fact, there are several. There's a feeling of agency, there's a feeling of intentionality, and there's a feeling of ownership, if you think about it in detail. So ownership means this is my hand. So if you, for example, take my hand and lift it up, I still have the feeling of ownership. It's still my hand, but I may not have the feeling of agency anymore. When you use a device called transcranial magnetic stimulation, you put it over my motor cortex, my hand will twitch, and I don't have a feeling of agency. Although I know it was my body, it was these neurons that get excited by this electromechanical device. It wasn't I that initiated it. It was something external. So you have to distinguish these different feelings. They're all caused by the brain, and they all are just like a feeling of seeing or feeling pain. There's a conscious sensation. Now, when it comes ultimately to causation, who does it? The theory says it's always the maximum of causal effect. That maximum of causal intrinsic power at a particular spatial temporal scale. That is what determines the cause. So it's not causal. Causality happens at a particular level. The level isn't the bottom. We all have the intuition, as Phil said, that ultimately the only thing that matters is the fundamental constituency of matter, quarks, let's say, right? And everything else is just on top of it. But the theory says no, it depends on the degeneracy and the redundancy of the mechanisms. And depending on those things, there is a specific scale at which the causal power is maximum. That is the scale at which you and your will, if you are a human, operates. So it argues for causal irreducibility. It's not true that you can reduce everything down to the level of superstrings ultimately. Yeah, ontologically you can, of course, right? Clearly you can, but in terms of causal determination, it occurs at a particular level of granularity.
And that can change, right? That's sort of the point. That can change over time, and
yes,
definitely. So they can sort of Okay, and one cool thing is that you write about also in your book is actually there's been developing some tools to measure consciousness. Which is not only a sort of like of academic interest, it actually has a lot of, clinical importance, because there are patients with different levels of consciousness, and it's of course very important to assess properly how conscious they are. So this is a collaboration with the people in Milan, I think, Massimini. I actually collaborate with him also on something else, but yeah. So what is the idea? There's something called the Zap and Zip or something.
Yeah, so Marcello Massimini, when he was a postdoc with, so he's a neurologist in Milan, as you pointed out. When he was a postdoc with Giulio Tononi to test IIT, they came up with this cool idea. It's a very, very crude. So this is it's a very crude way to measure consciousness. It's not really a metric. So it's not like measuring phi. So what it is, you take a brain and you perturb it. You hit it briefly. Think about a bell. You hit a bell with a hammer and you listen to the resonances. And you're essentially looking at the complexity of this wave that crisscrosses this bell. And you're essentially compressing it. So you're hitting it, that's a zap, with this device called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And then you're looking at you're measuring the EG, let's say in a 64, 128 channel EG, and you're looking how this electromagnetic stimulation propagates over the cortex. And you're looking at the complexity of that, and you compress it using Lempel-Ziff, this particular algorithm. So therefore, the procedure is sometimes called informally zap and zip. And you get something called perturbational complexity index that tells you how compressible is the brain response to this simple impulse. Right. So again, think of a bell. You hit the bell, and you can compute if it just locally, there's this local signal that quickly dies out. Right. It's very easy you can compress much of it, or let alone if there's only a single tone. If the brain, let's say, is isoelectric, if you're dead, you perturb the brain, it'll very quickly die out, and the EG will become flat. And you can completely compress that. So that has a PCR of 0. Or if all the things are totally independent of each electrode does its own thing, it's maximal compressor, it's maximal incompressible, it has a PCR of 1. That doesn't happen in normal people. In people like you and I who are conscious, when you do this procedure, there is a lot of complexity. And when you're in deep sleep, not in dream sleep, but in deep sleep without dreaming, the complexity is much, much less of this brain response. When you look at certain types of anesthesia, when you're truly anesthetized, the complexity of the brain is very, very low by this measure. When you're on drugs, like say on ketamine, which is actually not an anesthetic, but it's a dissociative agent, where people do report, of course, experiences, they just cannot communicate to the outside world anymore. The brain complexity is high. When you're on psychedelics, the brain complexity is high. However, when you're in a vegetative state, right? In other words, where you have eyes opening and closing, but the EG can be very disorganized, the complexity is very low. So there are now several papers that have shown this, and there's now a large-scale study that involves Milan and people at Harvard, people at Madison, people at a number of medical centers that are testing this in a systematic way in a clinic, particularly with people that have disorders of consciousness at a minimal conscious state, because many of these people you literally don't know. They are so badly injured that they cannot communicate, but you aren't sure that there isn't someone home. And this looks to be the first clinical useful measure that you can actually employ in an emergency room that would tell you whether the brain complexity is sufficient to support consciousness, or is it very low and so unlikely to support consciousness?
You mentioned briefly psychedelics. I've been to somewhere, at least one talk where they talk that in some sense that the psychedelic state is even more, in some sense, it's more active or whatever than the normal state. That some sense the normal state is between sleep and psychedelics. So is the brain even more complex?
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends on what you take. If you take psilocybin, the ingredient of the active ingredient magic mushroom, then what, of course, you'll see these fantastic color hallucination. You get this wonderful emergence of sound and sight. Right? You feel wonderful. You close your eyes, you have all these vivid colors. And people have measured that their phi seems to be higher than even normal. But you take other drugs like 5-MeO-DMT or DMT, dimethyltryptamine, known as the the spirit molecule, or 5-MeO-DMT, known as the God molecule, and your conscious...
It's amazing names they have, these drugs. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because they profoundly change your conscious experience. And it begins to resemble what people call a mystical experience, sometimes a near-death experience, in a fairly predictable way, where you die. I mean, from an experiential point of view, you go down in this tunnel, you disappear, you die, your sense of self is gone, your memory, your desires, your dream, all of that is gone. And you come to this state, Buddhists call it non-dual state. So there is no more distinction between perceiver and perceived. There's no more distinction between me and the rest of the world. There's only, so when I've done it, you come to this point of pure brightness. It's just a point of unbearable lightness, nothing else. There's no sound, there's no touch, there's no body, there's no ego, there's nothing. And this feeling of dread and ecstasy, this feeling of terror and ecstasy. It's a very different experience from anything else. It's absolutely terrifying. It's also ecstatic. You feel, you touch the face of God, but it's a conscious experience. And people are now trying to measure the brain activity during this very unusual state in volunteers.
Because that's been like an open, I mean, like after this, from the early 60s, when it was like Timothy Leary, and like then it was like almost banned, right?
Or it was banned.
Yeah, it was banned, exactly. So this is quite recent that they started to look into the clinical benefits or do a more systematic study.
Well, there are two things. So people have been doing it, informally, just for their own purposes. Yeah, but B, yes, in London and in Johns Hopkins here and in Zurich, people have been studying the therapeutic benefits of doing this together in a therapeutic context with a psychotherapist. And it seems to be of great benefit, particularly for major depressive disorders, for treatment-resistant depression, and for post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are now varieties of clinical trials. Here in the US, there are more than 60 clinical trials involving psilocybin for its beneficial therapeutic effects.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe having a podcast later on that topic. I think it's quite interesting. But now I want to talk a little bit, come back to this. I mean, as you say, we are through this AI revolution, and we get sort of like things like Siri and who appears to be quite appears to be more and more human. So you could suspect that they are actually getting having some kind of or a reasonable consciousness. But according to IIT, the way that present day computers are made, these like von Neumann machines or these digital computers, they have very little psi or phi, right? So it's not like they feel anything, regardless. When even a supercomputer doesn't feel anything. Is that correct?
Yeah. So so IIT would say that if you build a supercomputer simulation of your brain, let's say, and you do it correctly, and you put in, the 86 billion neurons, and you have the extracellular field and synaptic release and everything you want.
So and of course, need even more students, I think.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this may not happen for another, century or two.
Very good.
But let's say it happens, and of course, this simulation will, quote, wake up and will speak, right? Because if you give it a voice synthesizer, and of course, it'll claim to be conscious because that's what people do, right? So if it correctly models your behavior, or my behavior, it will behave like a conscious creature. But it's all a deep fake. It's all a deep fake. It's just as much as deep fake. Think about the following as a physicist. If you you can simulate gravity, of course, right? You can write down the 10 equations of general relativity, and you can simulate, let's see, the central black hole at the center of our galaxy, right? In Sagittarius A star, the one that got a Nobel Prize last year. But you don't have to be afraid, bless you, but you don't have to be concerned that you're going to be sucked into your simulation, right? So if you run the simulation, I can ask her, wait, don't do this. This is very dangerous, because if you simulate the gravitational attraction of a black star, you're going to be sucked into it. Oh, no, we're all going to be destroyed by it, right?
That's only the Matrix, maybe, but not in real life.
Well, why not? Yeah. Why not? Why are you not, why, although you perfectly well, correctly simulate all aspects of gravity of a collapsing black hole, why is the simulation not powerful enough to actually twist space-time around you? Because it doesn't have the causal power. It can simulate it, so it can do this abstract mathematical mapping from one set of variables to another set of variables. But that's very different from having causal power. So same thing with consciousness. This supercomputer can accurately map all aspects, all behaviors associated with consciousness, but unless it has the intrinsic causal power, it won't feel like anything. And it turns out the causal power, if you look at actually for Neumann machines, where typically you have one or two or three transistors talking to one or two or three other transistors, and you have this separation between memory and computing. You have a very low fan in, a very low fan out. Their causal power, you can compute explicitly, is tiny. And furthermore, it doesn't depend, you can show this, does not depend on the type of computer program you run. So whether you're doing a video game or whether you're doing tax software, this computer will of course have a tiny bit of causal power, but it's tiny. And it doesn't relate at all to the program that's running on it.
But the problem is not that it's made of silicon. It's, I mean, you can make, if you made other kinds of like
Correct.
computing devices, like with this analog, this VLSI and neuromorphic computing, which is
Correct.
also used in some. So it's not like you're not a carbon chauvinist. You're
correct. Correct. There's nothing supernatural about the brain. It's as I said, it's a piece of furniture like any other. And if you build it in silicon, like as you said, neuromorphic computing, that silicon thing would be conscious. But you have to build it in the likeness of the human brain. You can't simulate it. Simulation, and fundamentally, again, what it comes back, it's not about doing. It's not about simulating. It's about being. So you have to be the physical system, and you have to be in a particular state, and being means you have intrinsic causal power upon yourself. And unless the system has it, it will never be the same level of consciousness as you and I.
So if you want to defeat death and these analog computers are not ready yet, we can maybe store our consciousness things in this von Neumann computers in the cloud and not feel anything until we are sort of uploaded to another computer which is based on analog. Well, this is just science fiction, of course, but in principle.
Well, in principle, so the question: what do you need in order to recreate your consciousness? Do you need just your connectome? So many people say, yeah, once I have a connectome. So the connectome is a complete wiring, the complete weight matrix, as it were, of all 86 billion human neurons in one brain interacting with each other. But of course, we now know there's lots of other things. There is local field potential. There is non-synaptic release or, non-local release, right? Volume conduction. So you would have to mimic all of that in order to get to human consciousness. So yes, in principle, it's possible, but we are so far away from that right now that these dreams of uploading is really, we're talking about a distant future.
So, I mean, towards the end of your book, you talk about what are the consequences, what should we learn, how should this insight into IIT, how should that sort of, or if we believe that theory, where everybody has, lots of things have a little bit of mind, how should that change the way we say, treat animals? Or, I mean, you're a vegetarian, I think, right? Or, that's partially it's probably good for your health, but also for
I love meat. It is because, it happened many, many, many years ago when I love dogs, and my dog died in my arms, literally Nosy, a black German Shepherd, and I was so distraught and I was crying, and I thought, to myself, I was talking yesterday. I had lamb, the meat of the flesh of a sheep, and I really liked it. But I said, why am I so distraught about the death of this creature, yet another creature that roughly has the same complexity? And then partly to honor my dog, I said, okay, in her honor, I'll never eat flesh again, and I haven't. But then also because these are all conscious creatures, and if you look at particularly the way these creatures are raised under absolutely atrocious industrial conditions, it's just horrible. And they have conscious sensations. And yes, so So I think for the sake of other conscious creatures, we want to maximize the life of conscious creatures, particular creatures that are really have a strong consciousness, like dogs and cats and lambs and sheep and blue whales and other creatures. And it's now within our means to live without having to eat the flesh of animals.
But also plants have a fire, right?
Yeah, so in principle, as we spoke about earlier, most things, and certainly most organized biology, because this goes to the question, how far does consciousness reach if we just stick within the biology? Okay, so clearly it's mammals, but then if you look at behavioral, if you look at ravens, corvids, big birds, they're very complex. If you look at octopus and squids, right, they all there's this wonderful movie, My Teacher Octopus, right? Very powerful.
I was more thinking that sort of if you are sort of worried about, say, eating insects, maybe. I mean, you could find plants that we eat that are a higher IIT than a bee, maybe, or I wouldn't think so. But I mean, in principle, you could have to do these calculations too.
In principle, yes. So it's a moral judgment of I want to live. Okay, so I have to eat something. So, I mean, all moral judgments is always relative, right? Thou shalt not kill, but in self-defense I can kill, or in a war I can kill, or then there's abortion, right? So clearly, these are complicated topics. And in general, we should avoid eating needlessly, raising under atrocious conditions, creatures that have high levels of consciousness.
So, I just want to, we're closing in on the end here, and you're now leading this project Mindscope at Allen, and focusing a lot on the mouse and modeling and experiments and everything. So and you're also doing this in order to explore this IIT in mice, right, and possible. So how do you go about doing that?
Well, I mean, as we spoke earlier, mouse is a very good model system for the human brain. In fact, at the level of individual neurons, we know this. We study human neurons, we study mouse neurons. And I once did this at an alt staff where I had 300 people of my institute, and I showed them one after the other, mouse neurons and human neurons. And I removed the scale bar because the human neurons are 3 times taller than mouse neurons. They're indistinguishable. They all look the same.
But you need to be able to probe the consciousness of mice, right? And so you need to be able to measure that, and that, I guess, with some kind of behavior.
Yes, yeah. So we do behaviors. We do behaviors that are somewhat related, like we do a visual masking paradigm, right? Where we show, in humans we can do this, and in monkeys, where I show an image and I immediately follow it by a second image, and so you can wipe out the percept of that original image. It's called masking. It's a 150-year-old technique. We've now shown we can do the same in mice. But of course, what we can do in mice that we can't do in humans, we can manipulate the brain very, very precisely. And so the same thing with zap and zip. We've reproduced the zap and zip procedure of Marcello Massimini. We've done the same thing. We electrically stimulate the brain of a mouse. We have an EEG array and we measure it, and we can see something very similar, these waves, and we can compute the complexity similar to what a group in Oslo has done in rats. So you have to be careful, but you can map these things from a human to a mouse.
Yeah. Cool. And so the final question is, the title of your last book is The Feeling of Life Itself, and why consciousness is widespread. I think we talked a lot about that, but can't be computed. But sometimes you gave us the recipe with computing phi. So when they say it can't be computed, you mean like in practice, or is it always going to be beyond reach?
No, I don't mean in practice. They are not computing consciousness. I'm computing a measure of consciousness.
Sure.
What I mean that it is not a question of, anything else can be computed, in the sense that I have a computer, I set it up in a particular state, it goes through its algorithm, and then I get the answer. You can compute aspects of consciousness, but you cannot compute consciousness in itself. Consciousness has to be experienced by the system. It's part of the physics of the system.
So that's what you meant, yeah.
Yes. So unless you mimic the physics of the system, you cannot compute it. So that's what I mean. A supercomputer, a conventional supercomputer living in the cloud, you cannot compute. It will not be conscious. Although you can ask Alexa whether it's conscious, and Alexa will tell you. Okay, go ahead, ask her. Okay, or Siri, ask Siri.
Ask Siri. I use Siri. Probably some nerd in there who has made a funny comment.
Of course, it's all fake. It's a deep fake.
For sure. Cool. Well, thanks a lot for coming to the podcast. So,
you're welcome. That was a great pleasure.